Hello. Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to dtalks, that is Disruptive Talks on Education. And today we have with us Ma'am Joy Allcock. Hello, Joy, welcome to the show. And today's topic is improving literacy outcomes, challenges, and solutions. It's such a pleasure to have you over, Joy. Joy has been working with children for nearly 50 years. After training as an occupational therapist, she worked with children living with trauma and long term illness, finding ways to help them manage an altered reality. She also worked in a child psychiatric unit and as a family grief counselor. Hi. So, also, a little bit more about her work. Joy, through the 1990s, worked as an occupational therapist, including assessing the developing skills in 4 to 5 years old to see if there was a link between mastery of cognitive, language, and motor skills and literacy access. What she learned is that these skills are important, but there is a lot more to learning to read and write than simply being developmentally ready to learn. Teaching children to read and write means having in depth knowledge of the skills and knowledge they need to learn, understanding the foundational skills and knowledge already in place, having a flexible approach to instruction that takes all these things into account. So, Joy has been working very closely with children since then. Between 2002 and 2005, she also led a project with children to improve the literacy outcomes in a large secondary school in low socio-economic area, and many students in this school did not speak English as their primary language at home, and most students were of Maori or Pacific ethnicity. So she was the one who got these students that level. So she has assessed the literacy and vocabulary knowledge, critically analyzed the data. Using the data, she has designed literacy interventions that targeted the skills that needed to be taught. She grouped the students, suspended the English curriculum for most at risk students in year 90. Then she was providing professional learning and development to teachers who taught the most risk year 9 and 10 students in other areas. So she has done huge work and done so many projects. So now over to you, Joy, to hear more about your experiences and your work. Welcome again.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to share my work and the work that I've done with many, many teachers over the years. I have got a PowerPoint which I'm just going to talk to start with. Can we go back to the beginning of the PowerPoint? Yeah, we'll just quickly go back through. Okay, so if we could just go to the next screen, I think Annapurna, you've talked a bit about my background. So I have been working with children in lots of different ways, and I think the thing that amazes me always is that no matter what difficulties children face, they are determined to learn and to be successful. So it's a really positive experience working with them. So I'm just going to share some of my thoughts about the challenges we face in literacy and some ideas for tackling those challenges. Next screen, please. I'm just going to talk about these three challenges first. Children need access to educational opportunities. We know that there is a difference in the quality of education provided. I would say that would be true in every country, where some children receive more expert education than others. And children go to school, and despite going to school, they don't achieve as we would hope. Now, all of these issues have been present before the COVID pandemic, but they're much worse now. Next, please. So I'm just going to talk quickly about access to educational opportunities. That's an issue for every country to deal with. It's different country by country, but children need access to quality early childhood education, primary, secondary, and tertiary education. And being able to receive that education has got huge economic benefits, not just for the individuals, but for communities, countries, and in fact for the world. So I think that's why we're all here. We all know how important education is. Next, please. So why there are differences in the quality of education provided. We know that education should be equitable across communities, but it isn't. And that's probably true in most countries. So the less well-resourced communities often need more resources for education to be equitable. And the quality of education is often quite different for children from low socioeconomic communities, and often included in those groups are children from ethnic minorities. So they tend to be the students who miss out on the best quality education. Next, please. So why is it that children go to school and receive an education, but they don't succeed? Well, I think there's the areas we need to look at is instruction. And instruction is impacted by the politics of education, what's in vogue, rather than what evidence says is most effective. And I'm sure this is typical around the world. We seem to go from one approach to another, people looking for the silver bullet. And what we need to look at is what works, rather than what's most popular. Next, please. The other big area is teacher knowledge. Teachers need relevant knowledge and appropriate practice so that instruction is effective. Teachers often have to teach subjects they're not proficient in themselves. And the other thing is teachers don't know what they don't know. And I've had that said to me by teachers in the past. I didn't know that I should have taught that, because I didn't know that that was an important skill. And so we can't blame teachers for not knowing what they don't know. Next, please. Okay, next screen, please. Thank you. So there is an issue with teacher education. It's very hard for teacher education to keep up with what research says needs to be done. And so pre-service and postgraduate education doesn't always provide what teachers need when they're in the classroom. And the two main areas, lack of teacher knowledge and lack of evidence-based instruction, those have a huge negative impact on student achievement. Next, please. I'm going to just talk very briefly about these three issues in New Zealand. Children in New Zealand have access to education. That is not an issue here. But there are differences in the quality of education within schools, between schools, and between communities. And unfortunately, even though we are, a first world country, we have one of the largest gaps in the developed world between children who achieve well and those who do not. Next, please. Our students who, in international studies like the Pearls study, our top achieving students are amongst the top students in the world, but at least 25% of our students do poorly in the same studies. We have what's called the underachieving tail of achievement, where you've probably heard it described before as the Matthew effect, where those students who know the most do better and continue to do better, and their progress accelerates, and those who come to school with the least knowledge fall further and further behind. And these students are overrepresented in that group of underachieving tail. Students from low socioeconomic communities, Maori students, which is New Zealand's Indigenous people, students from the Pacific Islands who now live in New Zealand, Pacifica students, English language learners, and boys. And being the mother of 4 sons and 5 grandsons, it is a concern for me that we don't do so well teaching boys. Next, please. So I want to just very quickly share with you a project that was a community initiative to address educational inequity. I live in a city called Porirua City, which has a very large number of the people who live in the city are under 20. So we've got lots of children and young people in education. And we have an unusual demographic where we have communities in the high socioeconomic area and those in the low, and nothing in between. So in 2013, an education summit called the Shine Summit was called by the City Council and many other organisations in the city to see what we could do as a community to address the inequitable outcomes. And there were 3 areas we focused on: early literacy, digital literacy, and vocational pathways. Now, early literacy was a priority because of the concern about the high rate of functional illiteracy in New Zealand, which people are surprised about, but it is a problem, and that's including in the city where we live. So I'd led an action research project in a school in our city for 3 years, which made a significant shift to students' reading and writing. And we believed that this project, we could replicate this project in any school, regardless of the socioeconomic status, and make the same difference. So that's how the Shine Literacy Project started. Next, please. So it was completely funded by community, supported by community organisations, and funded by donations from individuals, community groups, and philanthropic trusts, not just locally, but around New Zealand once the word got out what we were doing. Next, please. So just a little bit about the project. It was a scaled up version of this pilot that we'd run in the school, where we raised reading and writing by 30%. So when we started in this pilot study, approximately 60% of students were achieving as they should for reading and about 49% for writing. And that went up to 92% for reading and I think it was 82% for writing. And that school has maintained that level ever since. So a change in what we did in the first 3 years at school significantly lifted everyone's achievement. So based on that, Professor James Chapman from Massey University designed a larger, more robust project to see whether we could replicate these results. Next, please. So we had 32 schools that took part, 17 trial schools and 15 comparison schools, and we tracked 259 students from the day they started school for their first 2 years at school. Next, please. Okay, so we had this mix of students from high and low socioeconomic communities. We had 28 different ethnicities and a similar number of boys and girls, and approximately 20% of students in this group were English language learners. So what did we do? We provided classroom resources for instruction to make sure the instruction was appropriate. We provide professional learning and development for teachers, and we provided an assessment pathway, which included assessments and a digital app to help teachers understand what the assessment data was telling them so they could use it to drive instruction. And they were the 3 main areas we focused on. Okay. So we provided research-based resources so that teachers could use a new approach to teaching early literacy. And although I wrote these resources specifically for this project, they were based on more than 20 years of resource development, evaluation, and modification. I've been writing resources for teachers since the late 90s, and it's taken 20 years to get to a point where I've developed resources that are simple. They look simple, they look easy to use, but they're based on quite a specific approach that's taken a long time to develop. Okay. Next, please. We provided professional learning and development based on what children need to learn to be literate, and then what teachers need to know to teach literacy. And we found that a lot of teachers had gaps in their knowledge. Initially, this was face-to-face with all the teachers, and that was a really powerful way to build this network of teachers that made such a difference. But we recorded the PLD sessions and made them available as videos, and a lot of those videos are freely available on my website for anyone to use. Next, please. We provided assessments because what we wanted to do was use assessment data to drive instruction and also to measure the impact. So we had to know whether what we were doing was making a difference. It's no good just thinking, oh, yes, that seems good. We've got to know that it really worked. And we used the Beagle software application, which supported the data analysis and assessment-driven instruction. And that made a significant difference to the way that teachers used assessment. Next, please. So this is, in a nutshell, the teaching approach. We used a words to sounds to print approach, which what it really means is we started with students' prior knowledge, their oral language, and we used that knowledge to build literacy skills. So we were always teaching from the known, because children come to school with language they can speak, to the unknown, which was we then took that to the written word, which they didn't know anything about. We taught students to write as a platform for learning to read rather than the other way around. And we used this test, teach, and track approach. So we found out what kids knew already, what they didn't know, we taught what they needed to learn, we reassessed, and we kept tracking their results to make sure that they were moving in the right direction. And teachers did not need any prior knowledge to make this work because the resources we provided made sure that they could teach even if they didn't know a lot about this. And the combination of these elements were pretty powerful. So what happened is that the trial group made significant gains in all the literacy areas we measured: reading comprehension, accuracy, word identification, and spelling. And the gains were evident for those students who typically do less well in our classrooms. Next, please. I'm just going to show you one graph. You can see the first two pink bars. Those are our students from high socioeconomic areas, or high decile schools as they're called here. And you can see that they're nearly a year ahead. But by the time they've been at school for a year and a half, so they're 6.5, that's what the 6.5, 6.5 means, that's the age. They're well ahead of where they should be. And the other two, the orange bars, are our low socioeconomic communities, children from those communities. Now, they started school, the children in those two groups, with exactly the same knowledge. But after a year and a half at school, you can see that first orange bar, the children are reading above their chronological age on average. And the students who didn't have this approach are below. So we'd opened up a 6-month gap in achievement for the students from the low socioeconomic areas in 18 months at school. Now, the good news was this comparison schools then picked up this approach after 18 months into the project, and after 6 months, they had started to close that gap. So even if you've fallen behind a bit, you can catch kids up. So after 6 months, those students in the low decile comparison group were reading at their age level by the time they were 7. And they continued to increase their reading skills. Next, please. We also measured value added because what we wondered is, well, what if all children came to school with the same early literacy knowledge? Will it make any difference how you taught in that first couple of years? So a statistical procedure was used to assume that all children had the same literacy knowledge at school entry. And if that had been true, using this approach, the words to sound to print approach, the trial students still outperformed the comparison students. So it did matter what you did at school. It's not just what you know before you get there. Our Maori and Pacifica students got the same kind of results as New Zealand European students, and that is not a picture that we see in our schools. So the change of instruction leveled the playing field for students in the trial group, but more of the same instruction for the comparison group continued this inequitable results that we see in our schools, where New Zealand European children do much better than Maori and Pacifica students. So whatever we're doing in our classrooms, it is advantaging some children and disadvantaging others, even if they started school with the same knowledge. Next, please. Because there was a huge amount of excitement amongst the schools and teachers who did so well. Teachers were so thrilled when our first results went up, and we presented them after a year. The whole room burst into applause because the results were so fantastic. So the schools wanted to continue to work together after the 2-year project was over, and 26 of them continued to work together until 2020 to embed the changes in teacher practice. And we continue to assess using standardized assessments. Between 2,000 and 3,000 children by now, we were assessing them every year, and we found that every school and every year maintained a pattern of accelerated achievement. And sometimes we used John Hattie's effect size measure, and sometimes we found so that everybody was achieving more than a year's progress in a year, and some schools were getting progress like 3 years worth of achievement in a year. So it was kind of like an accumulating and accelerating progress. Next, please. So what we found is even if children come to school without a foundation of early literacy, you can accelerate their progress so that they are reading at least at their chronological age after 2 years at school. Next, please. And probably this is probably the most important thing. The nature of early literacy instruction in the first 2 years is critical. How you teach literacy is just as important, or almost more important, than if you teach it, because there are lots of ways of teaching literacy that do not bring about the results that you want. So how you teach it, that is the key to making this successful. Next, please. So what is the solution? Well, I would say the single most important thing is invest in our teachers. The key to raising student achievement is the teacher who teaches them. And I often say to teachers, you know, you're looking for a silver bullet, you want this program or that program, stand in front of the mirror, you are the silver bullet. The person who will make the most difference to your students is you. Next, please. I was quite amazed when I read this. This is from an article by John Hattie, who I'm sure most of you have probably heard of, because he's had a large input into how we measure the impact of educational success. And he's written a series of gold papers. As Good as Gold was the first one, with Aaron Hamilton. And in the first one, he says global expenditure on education exceeds $3.5 trillion US dollars per annum. Only 4% of the global spend on education is invested in educational products, resources, or in-service professional development. And their argument is that despite this investment, the returns are way too low, because it's still $140 billion spent on resources for teachers. Next, please. They also say too much is being, these are quotes from this article, too much is being invested in shiny things that look great but have too little evidence that they're delivering on their promises. We must privilege evidence of impact, and we must use this evidence to ensure that every learner gets a year's growth for a year's input. Next, please. For every weak resource or intervention that didn't move the needle on student progress, or it was only tepidly successful, it means that a far more effective initiative wasn't in place to improve teaching and learning. A year, 2 or 3 years or more could be squandered in this manner, not to mention the waste of money. Okay, next, please. So what did we learn from Shine? We learned that the schools that made the most success, it was engagement with principals, lead teachers, and classroom teachers. It was professional development and providing resources. Those were the key things: engagement, PLD, and resources. Okay, next, please. The schools that made the most difference were those whose principals supported and embraced it, and the changes were driven by the lead teachers. The changes they made to teaching practice became part of their school's way of teaching. When new teachers came in, they were inducted by the school and they were taught how to use assessment data to drive instruction. And those schools have continued to have the same kind of spectacular success because it is the way the school operates. Next, please. So the PLD that we provided was initially face-to-face, as I said before, and then it became accessible through videos. So we moved from making sure that teachers had a solid foundation of knowledge about how children acquire literacy. So what do children need to learn? And then we got teachers to reflect on their practice. What are you doing currently? What could you do differently? Now that you know when you work this way, you get these kind of outcomes. How could you pull in other resources to do that? And then we used assessments. So it was like a 3-stage progress. Make sure teachers know what they're teaching, get them to reflect on their practice, and then get them to use assessments to analyse data and drive instruction. Next, please. The goal of PLD was to upskill teacher knowledge because teacher knowledge is the key to student success. And by providing the PLD through virtual and remote options, supported by print-based or downloadable resources, you can make this PLD sustainable and widely transferable. I mean, that's one real advantage in a way that's come out of the pandemic. People realise that we can still communicate, we can still share, we can still teach using virtual and remote options. Next, please. Raising student achievement through resources. Everywhere you look, there's dozens of resources, and which one do you choose? You have to look for the evidence of impact. So we're driving along saying, where will I go? Why don't you take the arrow that's going to take you where you want to go, which is successful learning? And to get there, you have to know that the resources have got evidence of their impact. Next, please. So we want quality resources that ensure that instruction is evidence-based and also that provide teacher knowledge simultaneously. Now, one interesting thing happened in the SHINE project. We had some teachers who were new to the schools or for whatever reason they missed some of the PLD sessions. We had some teachers who had no PLD and some who missed some. And because they all used the resources with fidelity, because they were part of a project, their students did just as well as the students whose teachers had come for the PLD, because we built the PLD into the resources as well as providing it face-to-face. Okay, next please. So we can use resources to raise student achievement because the instruction is appropriate, and also to upskill teacher knowledge as you go. So just to summarise this whole thing, there are many assumptions made about why children don't achieve for literacy, and nobody knows which ones are true. But what we do know is that children can be successful if the instructional method is correct. Next one, please. We need to stop focusing on what children don't know and focus on what they need to learn. Next one. There are children in every school who don't achieve to their potential. So we need to disrupt this pattern of underachievement for all children, whatever school they're in. And this is a final quote from John Hattie and Aaron Hamilton. We know that while the problem is societal, it can be solved through education. If we invest in unlocking and effectively implementing the right stuff, because there are schools operating in very challenging situations that are making a real difference. It can be done. So that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much.
I can't hear you. You seem to have.
And look into your illustrations on. So my first question to you is, how have children been impacted by the unprecedented gap in their learning in the COVID time?
I think the the problems that exist after COVID, they actually existed before, but they're much worse now because children haven't been able to go to school, and children are actually quite anxious about the world. They feel unsafe and they are unsure what next week will bring. It's hard to learn when you're feeling safe, and I think those feelings of anxiety and insecurity will definitely impact on children's learning. We've been very lucky in New Zealand because we have not had the same kind of disastrous experience with COVID that most other countries have. And yet, yesterday, tomorrow was my 8-year-old grandson's birthday, and his dad asked him what he wanted for his birthday, and he said, "Get rid of COVID." And this is a child who hasn't even been hugely impacted in the way other children have. So the anxiety is enormous for children, and that does impact on their learning. We seem to have lost our connection.
Oh.
Hello again.
You would be, will they suffer socially and emotionally from the COVID slide?
Well, yes, because they've missed so many experiences. All the family and friendship experiences, extracurricular experiences that some children may have been able to go to. The way they belong in the world has changed because they're not connected anymore. They haven't been at school. They're not connected to their peers. And so it's all of that will impact on academic learning. I think it's a huge issue for children.
Yeah. What are some important ways? How can we build teacher capacity to support all students?
I think we have to support teachers if we're going to support students. And I think we need to look at the support mechanisms we've got in place for teachers, because don't forget, teachers have been impacted in the same way by the COVID pandemic, and they've lost family and friends. They've had the same kind of anxieties and feeling unsafe about the world as well, and yet they have to go to school and teach children and support them. So I think we need to look at what we're doing to support teachers emotionally as well. We need to look at what knowledge they've got, because now they're going to school and there might be someone who normally teaches in a year 3 classroom, and suddenly they've got children who are not managing at a year 3 level. So they've got to teach skills and knowledge that they haven't taught before or weren't expecting to teach. And how do they know what to do? How do they know where the children are at? And they've got some children who are doing well and some children who are doing less well. So it's a huge issue for teachers. And I think because the teachers are the key to solving this problem, that's what we should be putting our efforts into, making sure teachers are well supported.
Yeah, very true. Um, what's your strategy to deal with the problem of learning loss that has happened due to the digital divide?
I think we have to focus on what kids need to learn rather than what the curriculum says you need to do. That's what we had to do in that secondary project. We had students coming to school who couldn't do what was in the curriculum. So we had to say, right, let's use assessment to find out what you can do and where there are gaps, and let's teach to those. And we've got to pare it all back to what has to be taught. We had an experience in New Zealand. I can't even remember what year it was. I think it was 2013. We had a big earthquake in Christchurch, and children were out of school for a large number of weeks, and there was a big anxiety that all of the secondary students were going to fail their exams. But when they got back to school, teachers really honed in on what had to be taught, and the kids actually did better, and kids didn't drop out of school. All the things everyone had worried about, because all the stuff that wasn't vital was left to one side, and they just taught what needed to be taught. So I think if we could use assessments to find out what you know, what you don't know, and then we just teach to the gaps to try to accelerate progress to get kids back to the position where we want them to be, that would be my suggestion. Easier said than done, I'm sure, but I don't know how else to do it. It's got to be driven by what children need to learn.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Next question here is that how have you been promoting parents and community involvement in the literacy growth?
Well, I think what we did in the Shine project was a totally community-driven initiative, and what grew out of that was a whole group of people who really believed in the value of supporting children. And my experience working with teachers is that they're pretty amazing people. They get up and go to school every day because they want to make their students successful. And so by being part of a school, this community of schools in the city that I live, and part of the community reaching out to people who just want to help, you can actually be a catalyst for pulling things together, particularly because we found that what we did made a difference. Success is what people want. So if you can share that and try to make it easy for other people to follow, I think, I don't know what else to do except try to collaborate and build networks with people in your community so that the best things that really work shared with other people.
Yeah. Um, what would your message be to the world government, to the international NGOs, to the stakeholders working towards achieving the goals of SDG 4.1 on achieving universal foundation literacy and numeracy for all children?
Well, when you think about how much money is spent on education and how much of that, only 4% goes to resourcing teachers, I would say look at where the money's going. Look at what you are spending on teachers, and is it money well spent? Or is that 4%, that small amount, that 4%, if you squander that in the wrong things, what a terrible waste. If you invest in teachers and in teaching resources that are evidence-based, that will make a difference, then you can be really sure that it's going to be money well spent. Because money itself won't make any difference. You can throw money at things, it doesn't change anything. But if the money is spent on the right things, then you can make a difference. So that would be my suggestion.
Thank you so much, Joy. It is so amazing to hear your views on the whole concept of how the parents and children and the community can work in collaboration to bring about to eradicate literacy, and how the community can be involved in the literacy growth. So it has been such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being with us. And thank you, everybody. And this is, we end the show now. And thank you, everybody, for patient listening. This is Anupma Mahajan, your host, signing off for today.
Thank you.